I can ask all the speakers to take their seats, please, and we'll have some questions now. And Matt, that just blew my mind, by the way, that I hadn't quite considered the differences between extraction of non-renewable resources, such as hydrocarbons, versus renewable resources. So when you decommission one type of structure, it makes sense in some ways because the resource that you're extracting is no longer there. So our questions around what to do with that structure are still valid, and we've been looking at sort of environmental benefits and all, but the renewable resource will continue to be there. So in some ways, it's very, very different. You're removing the old turbine, the old structure, but there'll be a newer turbine, presumably. Yep. And so maybe we'll just keep building on these over time. But is that what we want? You know, going forward in thinking about that, are you seeing that there might be a need to keep these wind farm zones going for a long time? In which case, before we build them, we need to think about how we will use them in perpetuity, as you said.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I don't think I don't have the answer, of course, on that. I think that at the moment, as long as we don't have an alternative, we should think about it as something that could be there in perpetuity. We should also then, because that's the problem at the moment, that we keep building ever larger turbines, so they don't fit on the old foundations, and that makes it difficult. So maybe we should at some point say, okay, this is the maximum that we want to do, and because otherwise we keep getting this disturbance all the time. But it's a difficult decision. But I think from an ecology point of view, it's really key to make sure that we minimize the disturbance that we are creating with these huge, really huge areas of wind farms. Yeah.
Thank you. That was just my own personal thought there. But it'd be good now to open up for questions from the audience. I'm sure you have a few. Put you in the middle first, please.
Thanks very much. Sam Fanshawe, Blue Marine Foundation. I think that the last couple of days we've really heard a lot about the benefits of leaving it in situ. And I wondered if I could ask the panel, what are the benefits of full removal? Because we haven't heard a huge amount of that. And that leads on to the question, has a full cost-benefit analysis been done of the different scenarios, separately for oil and gas and separately for offshore wind? I'm assuming they have been done, but maybe that is a gross assumption. But yeah, the main question is, could you just run through the benefits of leaving, of full removal?
Yeah, shall I start? Yeah. Good question, thank you. Benefits of full removal. So we also have a responsibility in perpetuity, just as was discussed a moment ago. So potential benefits of removing everything could be construed as we have less to look after. So in the example of Northwest Hutton, one of the platforms I showed there where we've derogated the jacket footings, we do go back periodically, we pay for ROV inspections to go back and inspect these things. If they're not there, there's less to inspect. Now we do still have to go back anyway because there's wells beneath the ground that we also have to monitor. So you could argue that one benefit might be less monitoring. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I think I was going to just on the cost piece and on the full removal versus others. So when operators look at derogation opportunities, typically they'll look at whether an installation is over 10,000 tons and was installed after 1998, 1999. So they know which ones are in scope for them being able to apply for a derogation. That doesn't necessarily mean they'll be granted a derogation. But when we do our annual cost report and we show the future cost of decommissioning and 40 billion, it builds in that plan or that assumption of which ones do they intend to derogate. Based on the information we get from operators, we can also look at what are the risk costs So not including that figure, but what might the impact be if you had to remove all infrastructure as opposed to have some of the derogations. So we work with OPRED to provide and look at some of that information a bit more, and obviously because it's such a substantial cost, along with the P&A, the derogation of installations is probably the most significant cost piece of that puzzle. So we do look at the different situations. Just building on what Nick was saying, yeah, the liability and the monitoring and the future risk is a huge advantage if you did have the clear seabed and if you did remove everything. But obviously then you would take away opportunities for the reuse, repurposing, and potential shorter term cost savings. So certainly a lot of balance there.
Yeah, I think it's for wind and perhaps also for the oil and gas. I think the major benefit is indeed in creating space for other users, and in the circularity aspect that you can reuse the resources, like steel, for instance, that you can recycle them and use them in a good way again. And I think I think that's really something that is absolutely key to balance. That you do need to be able, especially the recycling part. I mean, that is incredibly important that you do that. And I think from an ecological point of view, I think what Stephen also said in the morning, that if you build all these wind farms and you all leave them all in place, you really lose a lot of soft sediment habitats in the end. And you also need to think about that. How much do we want to lose because we want to create more hard substrate habitats, and how much do we want to get rid of again of the hard substrate? So I think that's those are really also the benefits that should be considered.
Thank you. Another question over there.
Yes, thanks. My name is Marnix Vraag. I'm from Howell. Thanks for the interesting presentations. I was curious, in my daily job I work with also looking at biodegradable structures as an alternative, and I was curious how the panel looks at that, at using biodegradable structures as an alternative for conventional materials, to also, and also in the light of decommissioning, and what that might save in the future. So I'm curious about your opinion about that topic.
I'll dive in. I'll be honest, I don't know much about it. When we're developing a new oil and gas field, I'll caveat that a lot of what we do now builds on existing fields. So we do a lot of tiebacks to existing facilities. But if we were developing a new field, we would go through many years of a design process, which would include, of course, materials, and it would include in it making provision for decommissioning. I don't have any expertise in biodegradable materials. I would love to think they would be factored into the design and decisions would be made based upon them, but I'm not speaking from a place of knowledge. So.
Yeah, in terms of, I don't think there's much I'd add on that. Most of my dealings are with steel structures that were built quite a long time ago and are generally falling apart in some way, shape or form. But I think one of the other presentations touched, I think a couple did over the last couple of days on plastics and microplastics. And certainly from a decommissioning point of view, when we engage with regulators and bodies in other parts of the world, microplastics is one that keeps coming up. I think it was mentioned about Australia having quite a keen focus on that. So again, it's back to the cost and the future planning. At the moment, there's assumptions that industry will be able to leave certain structures in place, particularly when we're looking at sort of flexible and rigid lines. And if that were to change in the future, as well as the practical impact of that, the cost impact of that could be quite significant. So it's another one of those areas where there are strong environmental and cost drivers, but still a lot not fully explored or understood, certainly from a UK perspective.
Yeah, I think from a wind perspective, it's probably especially useful for if you really build artificial reefs, for instance, as an addition to the wind farms. Maybe you could also use it for scar protection. I don't know, but I think it's also a matter of being sure if it lasts long enough That's and really fulfills the aims that you need that you need the structure or you need the material for.
Sounding like you might open up a new area of research there. Any other questions? We have, yes, Chris Maggs.
Well, that was a very stark presentation about the cost, really amazing. So I think, if I understand it right, most of the money was extracted in the past and the costs are coming now. And we, the taxpayer, is going to pay half of it. We probably feel we didn't actually make that much because, well, we won't go into the politics. But the willingness to pay environmental economics, if the public in Britain really understood this and really understood that there could be an option to not remove them, given the fuss they made about a few quid for the NHS and Brexit, might this not be actually a very popular move to stop spending this money?
Exactly what you said. No, I think absolutely. It's in terms of taking my work or NSDA hat off for a second. It's absolutely the costs are huge, and the perception. The public perception is maybe not realising what is potentially going to the taxpayer. You also look at the fact that the reason we talk about wanting the work to happen soon is there's concern that some operators may leave the basin, and that throws up more of the could things default back to the government and further burden on the taxpayer. So that's one of the reasons we drive for work to happen soon. The other, from my point of view personally, is the supply chain. Particularly for the wells work, we're losing a lot of supply chain resources on a daily and weekly basis in the UK. And if they go abroad for development work or decom work or other activities that those units are capable of, will we get them back here? If we do, it'll cost even more. So you're absolutely right. The public perception, I think it does go under the radar a little bit. And I think it's those in the industry understand it. But it's not one, as you say, when you compare the sizable impact that some elements of this cost risk could have relative to what we see in the press to do with NHS and other matters, it's comparable, if not more so, in some of the costs. And how we raise that visibility, maybe look at a trade body representative from decommissioning sitting on the front row here. So I know there's a lot of challenges and a lot of work that is done through SAM and Decommission and through the likes of OE UK, in terms of engaging with government and with politicians, but I think there's still a lot that does go unknown. I don't know from a
there's
point of view.
Just to illustrate an example with an example, the complexity of the issue. So we have a big project in the Gulf of America right now, and it's called Project Boomerang, and it's called Boomerang for a reason, because there was a company that owned an awful lot of assets in Gulf of Mexico as it was that went bust. And they have different laws in the US, but effectively it went into bankruptcy to the US government, and then these assets got given back to other oil companies. We were one of them, and we've ended up with 12 of these assets. So yes, it's absolutely crucial that the public knows where the money's going and why it's going there, but we also need to get it right, because if lots of companies leave the basin, the decommissioning's still got to be done, and we might end up paying more for it in the end if we get it wrong.
It's a really interesting question. It also came up last year, Chris. Yeah, it hasn't quite. We haven't quite got an answer for that one yet. But like I heard to Richard's talk yesterday about controlling the narrative, and the message, and it sounds like this is quite a chunky message that maybe hasn't sunk into our consciousness yet.
It's too difficult. It's just too difficult to bring to the public in any way, I think.
Can I just have a comment?
Yeah, sure. There's a microphone coming now.
As Alistair said, I'm Sam Long, CEO for Decommission, which was Decom North Sea. My job is to talk about energy decommissioning onshore, offshore, global. Could I just contextualize some of that? UK nuclear civilian decommissioning is 4 billion per annum. Okay, so I know 40 billion sounds like a lot of money, and these companies are going to be paying most of the bill, half the bill. But actually, that 20 billion to the taxpayer is across the next 20 years. So it is a big number, but it isn't that big in terms of geopolitics and what else we have to address. But it is my job to try and get more of that going.
Good point, Sam.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Question over there.
Hi, it's Peter Oliver from Chevron. So I guess it's really a comment, not a question. But Chris, your comment kind of goes right to the nub of why the industry is doing Project 3 that we heard about from Henk yesterday. Because our sense is that a lot of folks aren't really aware of the trade-offs that are contingent on in decommissioning, the costs, the environmental implications, and so on. So that was really why when we got together as an industry committee, we actually wanted to kind of frame up a project in that area. It was so that we could start to understand a little bit better what the social perceptions around that particular issue were. So really that's kind of what we're investigating with that project, and that's why it's happening in another part of INSITE.
Yeah. Thank you, Peter. Good reference there for INSITE's work that's coming up. Look forward to more of that over the next year. Some more questions? Thoughts or comments? Yes, just in the front row there.
Watch out for this one. Okay, so are we having a very Northwest European dialogue in this room right now? I say that as somebody who goes to Southeast Asia, Australia. I haven't been to Brazil recently. A lot of what we do, people think is very oil and gas orientated, but you have to be more holistic and think across the bigger span. Some of those regions have completely different views. They have completely different regulations. And I love the science. I come from an environmental background myself, so I love being here. It's great to hear it all again. But actually, are we very inwardly focused on the North Sea? And are the other regions going to look at us and, I don't hate to say the word laugh. There's an individual in here who I know globally looks as well. There's a couple here who've got a global perspective. Other regions kind of scratch their head and go, well, what the hell's going on in Northwest Europe at the moment? Is that an unfair comment? Can we reach kind of global parity through the scientific community to kind of tackle some of those geopolitics?
I'll buy you some space. Yeah, I totally agree. I think, but we do see a spectrum. It's not to say the North Sea is. I don't see it being laughed at, but in all the regions where we have decommissioning, there is a spectrum ranging from some countries where we don't do decommissioning. The government just says, give us everything back, and we go, well, if that's what you really want, that's what we'll do, to the North Sea where we are much more driven by a goal-setting regulatory regime, and everything in between. But I did mention it in the presentation, I think we're missing a trick a little bit, where by comparison with the Gulf of Mexico, where they're celebrating different techniques.
I think what I'd add to that, and I know Sam's point where he's coming from, I think we have achieved a lot of good results in the past in the UK for decommissioning. When you look at how mature the basin is, what has been done, but also the regulatory landscape that's enabled, as I spoke briefly about the flexibility of when that work gets done. When the NSTA first produced the cost estimate for decommissioning, it was 59 billion, and it's come down to 40. That's not by magic overnight. Certainly not anything I've done. I think I've joined and it's started to go back up, so we'll need to look into that. But actually a lot of that was to do with campaigning for wells and plugging and abandonment, and that was because there was flexibility in the legislation to do that. Conversely, now we're in a position, with other factors, fiscal and external, and opportunities elsewhere in the globe, that now perhaps that set of regulations isn't benefiting us. And people often say to me, in Australia, it's 4 years from COP to do this. And you could say, yeah, places like that, you're going to have the certainty of work for the supply chain, the cost, the way that things are done, but you're also going to have a spike potentially of work, and it's going to drive prices up, and then what are the industry and the skilled professionals going to do thereafter? So there's no regulatory regime for it that I've seen that's perfect. I think R1 has brought us a lot of benefits over the years, but we're now feeling quite a constraint with a mix of those internal and external pressures. And ideally, it would be a bit of a pick and mix, that you could pick the different things that they do in other parts of the world and make your own set tomorrow, but it doesn't quite work that way. So we have gained a lot from what's there, but we're certainly seeing some of the challenges now that other areas of the world maybe aren't seeing in the same light.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything to add to that.
It's a really interesting point. Thanks for raising that decommissioning practice is not the same all over the world. That, you know, there are different advantages, disadvantages, but it's interesting what you were saying, Alistair, there, that over time it seems that sometimes the horse you've backed, if we go back to the horse analogy from Stephen this morning, sometimes the horse you backed might not necessarily be the most fit one for that point in the race. So maybe we need to switch horses at times. Are we even a pick and mix there in the next one? But we'll go to the next question. Peter.
Yeah, it's not really a question, but it's another comment. So I think there's a little bit of a perception that if the regulation says that you can reef or reef in place a structure, then that's going to be a free-for-all for companies, and they're just going to want to kind of leave everything in the ocean. But really, that's not the case. If you look at the history of the Gulf of Mexico, where, as we heard, we've got a regulatory regime which supports reefing, only 14% of the structures have actually been reefed there. So the majority have actually been taken out. That's even where you are allowed to reef. So most structures are fully removed, even in that case. So, and I think if you look in other jurisdictions around the world, there's lots of very good reasons for fully removing structures. And typically allowing reefing is not a free-for-all. It's one of these things where there's actually a lot of other things that you need to kind of take into account when you're actually considering these decisions. And reefing is one outcome that makes sense in some circumstances, but not all. And our problem in the North Sea is we've just got this blanket. Everything has to, the seabed has to be clean. And of course, that doesn't always make sense, from our perspective. There's in a lot of cases, it would actually make more sense for that particular structure to be removed, and in other cases, it might make more sense to leave it in place. But we don't have that flexibility, and I think that's, from an industry perspective, that's the problem that we have is that flexibility to make decisions based upon the circumstances of the situation is removed. So just a thought. Yeah.
Thanks for that, Peter. The case-by-case approach there, there do seem to be advantages there, but it sounds like it's not a foregone conclusion either. Question in the front row, and then up there.
Thanks, Henk. So it's a question for the panel, I guess, based upon what Peter's just said. What do you think will happen in 2027 when OSPAR look at regulations for offshore wind? What do you think about the risk that the offshore wind industry is going to have that flexibility that Peter was talking about taken away from them?
Well, I think the very clear risk is that OSPAR will go for a clean seabed again, and that there will be no room, just like in OSPAR 98.3, that there's actually no room to consider anything else than a clean seabed on the basis of ecological considerations. Because I think you raised a good point, I think, about the current regulations also for oil and gas, that if you look at the OSPAR 98.3, it's really only allowing for derogations on fully technical and cost issues or reasons, and not for ecological purposes. And I think that is really something that I would rather not like to see also happen with offshore wind farms, because I think that can create a huge problem, really. That will really increase the pressure on the environment from offshore wind construction, removal, repowering, these continuous cycles all the time.
Yes, thanks for that. Good question. Are there other lessons that we could learn from one industry to the other industry in this context?
Yes, of course there are lots. I pause because I'm not sure how the best way for that knowledge transfer to occur would be. But I guess one of the messages I tried to get across in the presentation is we've been going at offshore oil and gas decommissioning for decades. It's not new. So there's a wealth of body of knowledge there that we must springboard on. We can't ignore.
Yeah. you know what you're doing.
Sometimes.
And I think one thing that I would like the wind sector to learn is that you need to think about this really long time in advance, and not say, oh, decommissioning, that's something in 40 years for us. So we don't need to bother about OSPAR, for instance, or we don't need to bother about this, how we're going to do. We'll find out. I think that's something that you could learn from the industry, that's not the wisest thing to do.
There's another opportunity there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Question at the top, yeah.
Debbie Russell, SMRU, University of St Andrews. Just a question for a panel about pipelines and kind of what the latest update on pipelines in terms of them being trenched and buried, and in terms of the microplastic stock. And I'm just wondering, what the plans are and any thoughts on that. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll start. So, hot topic, of course. And it was great to have one of the presentations on microplastics as well. One of the organisations we're engaged with is IOGP, International Oil and Gas Producers. They have a dedicated, they've recognised that we need to do something about plastics as an industry. We need to work out what the right answer is. We don't know what the right answer is yet. So, hot topic.
I think I'd maybe add on the broader sort of pipelines piece, it's interesting when people talk, in my area, when people talk about reuse and repurposing, and people who are out with industry say, oh, you could use this topsides for that and this for whatever, and then you see the structural integrity of some of them and you think, maybe not. But there is real opportunity in the pipelines and trunk lines, especially in the UK. I think we've looked at 90 or 100 lines that could be repurposed for CCS or hydrogen applications. It's a bit of a difficult one to quantify because it depends on which of those projects may or may not go ahead. But certainly in terms of the technical specifications and the routings and areas, that's definitely an area of interest. So I appreciate that's talking about pipelines more generally rather than looking at the plastics piece. But I think that's an area that if we really want to harness an opportunity and save hundreds of millions for new lines, then making sure that we identify and repurpose those is key. And then the politics that comes into that is whoever owns or operates the pipeline at the moment, how do we make sure that they conserve it or pig it or inspect it in such a way that it can be used for an opportunity, especially if we don't yet know what that opportunity is, which raises another question mark as to how we do that. So that's a strong focus area for us from an NSTA point of view, and a real opportunity, I think, for the UK. Not ruling out the reuse of topsides. Some ideas are a bit wackier than others. I don't think we'll have any roller coasters in the UK offshore like they're looking at in some other areas, but the pipelines and trunk lines still represent a huge opportunity in that regard.
Okay. We have a question here.
Yeah, Bert Volkema. I think I'm looking at Annemette for maybe a little bit of context about your ideas, because you have been working in this area for a very long time. I think you've looked at it from every angle. Impact, cost, benefit, nothing works basically after so many years. But sometimes creating money flows in different directions, suddenly people get enthusiastic, particularly if the money starts to flow in their direction. And I seem to remember that you've been enthusiastic about maybe a North Sea fund, for example, where some of those profits that people perceive, cost reductions I should say, that people perceive flows to operators would maybe go into a slightly different direction and create a visible general societal benefit. Would you like to say something, and could maybe the other panel members comment on your ideas?
Yeah, certainly. I'm still very enthusiastic about the North Sea funds being funded by the companies or and the states that are putting down infrastructure in the North Sea, and maybe funding it by potential cost savings of decommissioning. I think that was indeed the idea of the Living North Sea initiative a long time ago when I worked at that. And I think it's still a very good idea. I think the challenge that we're facing with such a fund is that if you look at leaving parts of a jacket in place, for instance, we just saw your calculations. It's a relatively small amount of a small part of the total cost of decommissioning. And in the southern North Sea, for instance, it's probably not at all saving costs. So if you have to do it only based on the cost savings, it's probably going to be less than I hoped at that time. That's, let's say, if I put it that way. But in the UK, it would be a lot more than in the Netherlands, definitely. At the same time, I think that if you would be able to, with wind farms, if you would be able to upfront make clearer arrangements about decommissioning and potentially leaving scour protection at least in place and leaving nature, nature positive elements in place, I think you could create a situation where the cost for that where there are now reservations being made could go down. And that could perhaps help the rollout of offshore wind and in that sense the energy transition as such. But it could also lead to more investment in nature positive initiatives in wind farms.
I think I'd add quickly, just if that's okay, on the topic of learnings from oil and gas. Work's ongoing in industry at the moment on post-decom liability. It's still not something that is bottomed out, and there's trade groups and operators looking at that to see what might be the most sensible way, or what might options be that they can table for that. And it's a very difficult topic. I think someone mentioned earlier, what topics are too difficult to look at. And in hindsight, I think if something like that had been looked at earlier in the day for a lot of these developments, there'd be more clarity and more certainty in terms of cost and less risk going forward. So certainly a learning, for offshore wind, and it's something that's being thought about for CCS for sure. So yeah, the who does what after, and whether a fund of some nature is able to be sorted is a key piece.
Not much more to add on that one, no.
Okay. Well, we're almost at the end of the session. We've just got one more question over there. Oh, we don't have one more question over there. So we are now at the end of the session. Can you put your hands together for our panel, please?